From the mid-1980s, for about 30 years thereafter, I looked on and off at the 1948 war, and in 2008 I published a book called 1948, A History of the First Arab-Israeli War. And what I'm actually going to talk about here is some of the conclusions I came to in that book, some of which are conventional wisdom and some of which are different. The 1948 war was the most important of the Israeli-Arab wars. There have been 5, 6, 7, it depends how you count, but that was the most important of the wars. It was the most important because it changed the geopolitics of the Middle East by planting, for two reasons. One, by planting in the Middle East, in the center of the Middle East, a Jewish state, dividing the Arab world in two, dividing the Islamic world into two parts, West and East. A great trauma for Muslims and for Arabs. They were used to sort of territorial contiguity, and this was broken by the creation of the State of Israel in that war. And the second reason that war was most important of the wars was the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem, which was the expression of the collapse of Palestinian society, the major expression of the collapse of Palestinian society in the course of the 1948 war. 700,000 Palestinians were uprooted from their homes as a result of that war. Most of them, incidentally, moving to other parts of Palestine, not out of the country, but still they were granted the designation refugees by the international community. Now the war, the 48 war, which erupted in end of November 1947, and ended in fact in January 49, the 48 war was the result of the friction between the native Arab community living in Palestine and the influx of Zionist Jews from 1882 onwards in successive waves, basically in small numbers, but in successive waves coming to Palestine and establishing settlements in Palestine with the aim of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, if not all of Palestine, at least in part of Palestine. And this friction involving the resistance of the locals, which gradually grew as a political consciousness also expanded among them, this resistance to the influx of the Zionist Jews and their settlement in the land culminated in 1947 with the outbreak of the 48 war. It's worth knowing that by the end of 1947, there were in Palestine 650,000 Jews altogether, 650,000, and twice that number of Arabs, what are later called Palestinian Arabs. The war was an unusual war. It was triggered, incidentally. Why did it break out on the 30th of November? The shooting began on the 30th of November 1947. It was triggered by the day before by the UN General Assembly resolution 181, which recommended the partition of Palestine into two states. The international community, as embodied in the General Assembly of the UN, decided that the fairest solution to the Palestine problem, this constant friction and conflict between the Palestine Arabs and the Jews in Palestine, was to divide the country physically into two states, one for the Arabs, an Arab-Palestinian state, and the other part for the Jews, a Jewish state in Palestine. The resolution passed on the 29th of November. On the 30th, Palestinian Arabs unleashed the war, not in an organized fashion, as later Israeli propaganda said, essentially in a spontaneous manner. They started shooting at Jews, Jewish traffic, Jewish settlements, Jewish bystanders in towns, and this, on the 30th of November, the shooting started, and it snowballed into a full-scale civil war between the Jews of Palestine and the Arabs of Palestine, while a third country, the British, still ruled the country officially until the 14th, 15th of May. The British had conquered Palestine from the Turks in 1917, 1918 in two stages, and instituted what was called a mandate over Palestine. 1917, 1921, they instituted the mandate and ruled the country for 30 years until 1948. In 47, they told the UN, we don't want to rule here anymore. It's of no benefit to us. We can't force the two sides to reach a compromise. Neither of them will listen to us. And so we want out. And they passed the problem back to the United Nations, the problem which the League of Nations had given them when it gave them the mandate, back to the United Nations, the successor body of the League of Nations. They passed it to the United Nations. The UN sent a commission to investigate what was the best solution, and the General Assembly essentially adopted UNSCOP, the Commission's recommendation of partition. Palestinian Arabs and the Arab states around universally denounced this solution. The Palestinian Arabs wanted all of Palestine for themselves. They didn't want any part of Palestine for a Jewish state. The UN had said, let's partition the country. They didn't accept that. They started shooting, and that was the beginning of the first stage of the 48 war. The unleashing of hostilities on the 30th of November 47. The Jewish Agency, which represented the Jewish community in Palestine, accepted the UN resolution, accepted in a sense the principle of partition, but of course this was of no use as the Palestinians unleashed this war. Now the war was unusual in a number of ways, and I'm going to talk about the nature of the war. It was a two-part war. There were two parts, two distinct parts to the war. The first was this intercommunal clash between the Jews and Arabs of Palestine as the British nominally ruled the country until May 48. In other words, for the first half year, the two communities are shooting at each other, placing bombs, mining and whatever, assaulting each other. Essentially, the Arabs of Palestine assaulting the Jews. Then the Jews in April 48 go over to the offensive, and they begin a series of offensives which lead to the collapse of Palestinian Arab society and of their military arms, and victory for the Jews in this civil war, which lasted from November 47 until May 48, the defeat of the Palestinian Arabs. At this stage begins the second stage of the war, and that is when the Arab states around Palestine, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq, send their armies into Palestine on the 15th of May, invade Palestine, initiating the second stage of the war, which is essentially a conventional war between the armies of the states, the Arab states, and of the newborn state of Israel, a war between states. Israel versus the Arab states who invade Palestine, most of whom attack Israel. I'll explain this this word most in a second. The war ends 6-7 months later in January, when the Arab armies, the invading Arab armies, are essentially defeated by Israel, and the Arabs sue for armistice, and armistice agreements which formally end the 48 war between Israel, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, and Israel, Syria. These armistice agreements are signed between February 49 and July 49. And that's the formal end of the war, but the shooting had ended already in January 49, by which time the Arab armies had been defeated. Now, traditionally, the explanation of the war, of what the war was about, what sort of war was the 48 war, the conventional wisdom has it that it was a political, territorial war between two national groups and their supporters on the Arab side, the states, if you like, nation states, Arab nation states. In other words, a national war over territory. But even if we accept that as defining the character, the nature of the 48 war, it's still highly unusual, because wars between nation states are normally fought over hinterlands, over the marchlands, over Alsace-Lorraine between Germany and France, where they each try and get hold of these borderland provinces. But they're not fought over the whole of the country. Germany doesn't want to take over and destroy France. France doesn't want to take over and destroy all of Germany. It's fought about borderlands. Here we have a war in which one side, at least, the Palestinian Arabs and the Arab states, essentially want all of Palestine for themselves, not some chunk of Palestine, but all of Palestine. So in that sense, if it was a conventional a political territorial war, it was unusual in this all or nothing manner, which I've just described. After looking over the documentation, the available documentation for the 48 war, I reached the conclusion that the war wasn't just, it was also a political national war, certainly as fought over from the Jewish side, but also on the part of many of the Arabs. It was a war in their minds over pieces of territory belonging to this or that nation and claims to this or that territory as well. It was that, but it was also a cultural and religious war. And in this, other historians have objected to my characterization, this part of the characterization of the war, that it was also a cultural religious war. It was a cultural religious war from the Arab side, not from the Jewish side, from the Arab side. Many Arabs saw the war as a jihad, as a war of religion, as something dictated by Allah's will, by God's will, to attack and invade and conquer Palestine, to take it back from the infidel, the Jews, who just settled there and were taking it over for Jewish sovereignty. This was uncountenanceable, and they were motivated by this religious impulse to take over the country. On the 1st of December, 1947, 3-4 days after the United Nations had passed its resolution recommending partition, which included, of course, the establishment of a Jewish state in part of Palestine, on the 1st of December 47, the ulama of Al-Azhar University, which Al-Azhar is the oldest university in the Muslim Arab world. It is the seat of the scholars, the definers of Islam, the ulama, the council of sages or theologians, if you like, chaired by the rector of Al-Azhar University. The ulama of Al-Azhar on the 1st of December 47, and this represents, of course, the Sunni Arab world, that is the majority sect within the Muslim world. This ulama defines what should be God's will, what God wants in terms of the Sunni Arab world. They passed a fatwa, they issued a fatwa on the 1st of December 47, calling for all Muslims around the world to unite and drive out the Zionists who intended to establish a state in line with the UN resolution, to drive out the Zionists from Palestine. It called on young men to join the fight physically. It called on others to contribute money to further this aim. This fatwa, this religious ruling by the most important body in the Sunni Arab world, was reiterated in April 1948 in advance of the pan-Arab invasion of Palestine of the 15th of May. In other words, the ulama of Al-Azhar was basically telling the Arab governments, especially the government of their own country, of Egypt, the leading Arab state, you must join this fight. You must join this invasion of Palestine, which everybody was calling for, or many people were calling for in the Arab world. They too endorsed it in religious terms as jihad. April 48. And again, the ulama of Al-Azhar, and this is what's interesting, repeated the fatwa calling for jihad again in December 48, by which time the Arabs had lost the war. The Egyptian army was basically was being ejected from the southern part of Palestine, from the Negev. It was almost surrounded by Israeli troops. And here was the ulama of Al-Azhar saying, essentially, you've lost this round, we've lost this round, but you must continue the fight because this is God's will, as enunciated by the ulama of Al-Azhar in December 1948. In other words, we've lost this round, you must continue the jihad when we have better circumstances, more power down the road. There's a woman called Matiel Murannam who appears in 1948. She was a Lebanese Christian. She was born in Lebanon, a Christian from Lebanon. She'd married a Muslim and moved to Jerusalem either in the early 40s or just before. And she headed what was called the Palestine Women's Organization, a very, very small group of people, but there was something called Palestine Women's Organization affiliated to the Arab Higher Committee. The Arab Higher Committee was the ruling body of the Palestine Arab National Movement, led by a man called Hajj Amin al-Husseini. He headed the Arab Higher Committee, and it had an affiliate, a women's organization, which was headed by this Christian woman from Lebanon who'd married into a Palestinian Muslim family. In January 1948, 2 months after the UN resolution, 2.5 months after the UN resolution, the partition resolution, she gave an interview, and we have the text of her responses to questions. And in it she said, this Christian woman from Lebanon, the UN decision has united all Arabs as they have never been united before, not even against the Crusaders. A Jewish state has no chance to survive now that the Holy War has been declared. All the Jews will eventually be massacred. What's interesting about this is it, I think, shows that the idea of jihad, of holy war, was in everybody's minds. It wasn't just some cleric living in Al-Azhar University or some cleric aligned to or listening to what was said by Al-Azhar in Palestine, but you've got this Christian woman who says exactly the same things and has adopted this rhetoric of holy war. So it was apparently quite pervasive. There are other proofs. I'm just giving you this incidental proof, which is interesting because we're talking about a Christian. So what I'm saying in short about the nature of the war, which is a bit unconventional and is not accepted by some historians, that it was not just a political national war, but from the Arab perspective, from the Muslim perspective, it was a religious cultural war as well against the infidel. It wasn't, incidentally, a religious cultural war from the Jewish side, as the Jews in 47, 48 perceived it. The religious Jews in Palestine, the Jews who believed in God or worshipped God or whatever you want to call them, were probably less than 10% of the Jewish community in Palestine, as I said, which numbered 650,000. The movement, the Zionist movement, had been led by socialist and liberal Jews, Ben-Gurion, Weizmann, and so on, and the religious minority in Zionism was essentially insignificant in the movement. They did not control any major levers of power in the Yishuv, in the Jewish community in Palestine before 48, and weren't really to do so, even though they were in the coalition after 48, after Israeli governments came into being, but they weren't important. They didn't hold the foreign ministry, the army chiefs of staff, the defense ministry, the finance ministry, the prime ministership. All these were held by socialist or liberal Jews, not by religious Jews. When the Yishuv goes to war in 1947, when it's attacked by the Palestine Arabs and then again by the Arabs' armies surrounding Palestine, they're fighting a political war from their point of view to establish a Jewish state, not a religious war to fight against the invading or attempting to invade Muslim Arabs of Palestine or of the Arab states. They're fighting a political war to establish a state. Unfortunately, Israel has become growingly more religious over the years, more religious both in terms of the power of the religious in Israel and demographically, and this because it's a democracy, the demography is represented in the power structure. And so there are probably a lot of Jews today in Israel, not a majority, but certainly a quarter or a third of the Jews who also see the struggle with the Palestinian Arabs today, 2019, also in some form of religious perspective. But this wasn't true in 1948 because they weren't powerful, they were completely insignificant. The Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox community in Palestine in 1947-48 numbered less than 1% of the country. Today it's over 10%, and people project that it'll be 20 and 30% because they have 8 or 10 children each family, per family, and so on. But this wasn't the situation in 48. It wasn't a religious war in terms of the Jews in 48. That's as to the nature of the war. The second subject which rose when I was sort of thinking about what I was writing and concluding what I had emerged with from the documentation, maybe I'll say one more thing about the documentation. my book, 1948, and my previous books on the Palestinian refugee problem, Israel's border wars about the 1950s and so on, were based on archives. I think historians are supposed to work on the basis of archives, on the basis of documentation. There are historians who believe also in oral history and interviewing people and getting the facts or knowledge about the past from interviews. I'm not a great believer in that, especially when it comes to the remote past when people no longer exist, or most of whom exist are actually pretty senile or have forgotten most things or have colored their memories with things which aren't really memories but things they've learned since then or have been added to their memories or switched or changed their memories. So historians work on the basis of documentation. And the documentation for 1948 is profuse in the archives of the West. And the Israeli archives have enormous quantities of material. Every Jew thinks he knows how to write or likes to write or thinks he has to leave his stamp on history. So every sergeant writes a report, and every lieutenant writes a report, and every major, and every colonel, and every general. And you've got this millions and millions of documents in the IDF and the Defense Ministry archives and the Foreign Ministry archives, etc. So Israel has a very large archive from 48 on which to build, at least from the Israeli perspective, or various Israeli perspectives, because you've got left-wing Israelis, right-wing, and so on, to build the Israeli view of things. You also have British and American archives. The British were, of course, in charge of the country down to mid-1948 and produced an enormous amount of documentation themselves. The Americans were involved in various ways diplomatically, so that all their diplomatic legations, the consul general in Jerusalem, the ambassadors or ministers in Damascus and Amman and Beirut and Cairo, they all send reports daily or weekly to London, to Washington or to London or wherever it is, and are constantly sort of tapping on the Arab world, finding out what is going on in the Arab world, what Arab leaders are saying, what Arab leaders say they are doing, and so on and so forth. Enormous amount of American and British documentation. And there's also UN documentation. The UN has its own archives. They have observers in Palestine from a certain point on who are saying what is happening, who are reporting back about what is happening. So there is a lot of Western documentation about 48. When I was doing this, there wasn't French documentation available. Today, I think it's mostly available about 48. But at the time, you had this enormous amount of Western documentation, especially Israeli documentation, available on which to base what you were writing. Arab documentation is non-existent in terms of the historian. Non-existent means it's inaccessible. It's not that it doesn't exist. We don't know what exists because nobody has ever seen the archive of the Royal Court of Jordan, the archive of the Egyptian state, the archive of Damascus, and so on for 48. They don't open it before researchers, not Israeli, not American, not Arab. They don't see anything. They don't show anything. So we don't know. There may be lots of good material there, but nobody knows if it's there. Maybe they destroyed it, dictators sometimes, and all the Arab states are dictatorships. They often destroy what their predecessors had accumulated for various political internal reasons. So we don't know what's there. There may be good archives, there may be bad archives, but the Arab archives are closed to researchers of the 48 war. And probably for good reason. They felt that the Arab side had been humiliated, had lost the war. They didn't especially want to show off this humiliation by opening the documentation, highlighting or underlining this humiliation and so on. But in any case, Arab archives are closed basically for the conflict, the whole of the conflict, not just 48. You can't get to them. So this is a black hole in the sense of the historian who wants to write about the 48 war. The Arab side isn't really there out of their own mouths. What you do have, though, is Western intelligence agencies and Western diplomats and Israeli intelligence looking into the Arab world and reporting what they find from the Arab world. So you do get the Arab perspective, even if it's in some way filtered through Western or Israeli eyes. And that's, though, incidentally, any book, say, about the emergence of the modern state of Syria, or the emergence of modern Lebanon. They're all written, I'm talking about the 20s, 30s, 40s, they're all written on the basis of Western archives, French archives, British archives. They're not written on the basis of Arab archives, because they're not open. They don't have the material. You've got some Arab newspapers, they're not exactly the New York Times, so you can't really rely on information from Arab newspapers or Arab memoirs. Again, all memoirs are full of distortions. Arab memoirs are even less reliable than Western memoirs, by and large, to base things on. But in any case, people writing about the modern Arab world rely on Western archives. Look at any book on the French mandate in Syria, Lebanon, any book about the British mandate, Palestine, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan. You'll see that they're based on Western archives, not Arab sources. The second subject which I tackled, and in some ways maybe adding something new to it, was the war aims of the various sides in the 48 war. And we're talking about the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine before 48. The State of Israel declared on the 14th of May 48. Those are the Jewish side in the war. And in the Arab side, you've got the Palestinian Arabs, and then you've got a number of Arab states. So when you're looking at war aims, you have to look at all the different bodies to see what the war aims are. And here you are trammeled on the Arab side by the lack of Arab archives. It's a problem. But as I say, you've got Arab leaders, generals, etc., talking to Western diplomats, or as seen through intelligence agents. So we have, and you also have, in terms of the Arabs, what they did in 48. In other words, not just what they said, but what their soldiers and armies were doing to express what their intentions were when you're talking about war aims. On the Jewish side, it's fairly clear. As I say, the documentation is abundant. The war aim is clear. The Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine pre-May 48, fought in order to survive, to weather the Arab-Palestinian onslaught against the Jewish community. That was the main aim. But to this aim, in my view, accrued two further aims, one of which most historians accept, and the second one which is in dispute among certain Israeli historians. The second war aim, which I think emerges more or less in April 48, towards the end of the civil war part of the 48 war, is to expand the Jewish state's territory beyond what the United Nations had allocated in the partition resolution of November 47. The UN partition resolution, Palestine was composed from the river, the Jordan River, to the Mediterranean Sea, was composed of 10,000 square miles. That was the size of mandatory Palestine under the British, what the Arabs call Palestine, and the world essentially calls Palestine to this day. 10,000 square miles. The United Nations had allocated close to 6,000 square miles to the Jews and 4,000 plus square miles to the Arabs in the partition resolution. The war ends in 1949 with the Jews holding close to about 8,000 square miles of Palestine's territory. In other words, they added 2,000 square miles in the course of the war by taking over additional territory from basically from those pieces of territory allocated to the Palestinians, leaving about 2,000 square miles in the hands of Jordan, which had conquered the West Bank, or much of the West Bank, in the 48 war, and East Jerusalem, and Egypt, which had conquered the Gaza Strip in the 48 war. So Israel did expand, and as I say, I believe this was an intention, an aim, a war aim of the Zionist leadership, military and political, Ben-Gurion downwards, which accrued as a war aim more or less from April on. They wanted more territory. Now, it's interesting to note that they didn't take all the 10,000 square miles because they defeated the Arab armies. They could have, in terms of praxis, taken over the last 2,000 square miles, the West Bank of Jordan, the Gaza Strip, had they wanted to, within a few days. In fact, the commander of Israel's Southern Front, Yigal Allon, wrote a letter to Ben-Gurion in March 1949, just before Israel signed its armistice agreement with Jordan. He wrote to Ben-Gurion saying, let's take the West Bank. Give me the go-ahead, 3 days, and I'll give you the West Bank. That's what Allon said, and probably they could have done it because the Jordanian army in the beginning of 1949 numbered something like 12,000 soldiers. The Israeli army numbered 100,000 soldiers. 100,000 out of a population of 650,000. In other words, it was an enormous army, very large mobilization. And he said to me, I can take it in a few days, just give me the go-ahead. And Ben-Gurion says no. Ben-Gurion says no to Alon because he explains that the British won't like it, they might intervene. He didn't actually explain it much, but later he explains in various ways the British might intervene on Jordan's side. They had a defense pact with Jordan. There were lots of Arabs living in the West Bank, natives of the West Bank and refugees who'd poured into the West Bank from what had become Israel. And Ben-Gurion was fearful that many of these would stay, and therefore the Arab minority in Israel would grow enormously if Israel took over the West Bank. Maybe Alon thought they would be kicked out by the Israeli troops, but Ben-Gurion didn't assume that that would happen. And so he says no to Alon, and they don't take over the whole country. They take over only 2,000 additional square miles beyond the 6,000 allotted by the United Nations, but not the whole shebang. Now that's the second warring, and we know that more or less for a fact, that the Zionist leadership, in the course of the 48 war, from April on, wanted to increase the size of the Jewish state. They said, essentially, we accepted the UN resolution, we accepted 6,000 square miles, we said yes to the United Nations, the Arabs made war on us. Well, if they make war, we'll get what we can, but we don't want all of it because it'll mean too many Arabs in the population. It'll mean maybe the British will intervene and won't allow us to do this. So that's how it ended. The third, and here we reach a controversial subject among historians, certainly Israeli historians, and that is, I think, a third war aim accrued also in March, April 1948, and that was to reduce, a Jewish war aim, to reduce the number of Arabs who would be in the Jewish state when it emerged. In other words, the leadership under Ben-Gurion wanted as few Arabs as possible remaining in the Jewish state. Now, this didn't translate into policy. The Ben-Gurion didn't issue a directive, the Israeli cabinet didn't issue a directive, the general staff of the army didn't issue a directive. There wasn't a policy, an agreed policy, enunciated, etc., kick out the Arabs. There was no such policy. But Ben-Gurion did want less Arabs in the Jewish state when it emerged, and in some ways, indirectly, a whisper here, a wink there, an order here or there, he did get his generals to expel Arabs from here and there. And we have the famous case of Lydda and Ramle in July 1948, when Alon asks him, what shall we do with the Arab population? And he basically goes like this, meaning they understood, Alon and Rabin, who was next to him, understood, throw them out. And this is what happened in July 1948 in Lydda and Ramle, the two Arab towns near Tel Aviv. The population was expelled. But on the other hand, many Arabs remained in the state of Israel as it emerged in 1949. 160,000, in fact, remained and became Israeli citizens. We're talking about 20% of the country's population was Arab in 1949, and they got citizenship just like the Israelis got citizenship. So had there been a policy of expelling the Arabs, one would assume the 160,000 wouldn't have been allowed to stay, but they were allowed to stay because down the chain of command and in the various political parties, there was this dissent. People didn't accept Ben-Gurion's winked and hinted line of get rid of as many as you can, get rid of meaning expel. They said, no, we don't want to expel. The left-wing Mapam party didn't want to expel Arabs. Some of the generals didn't follow through, even if there had been a wink or even Ben-Gurion himself. We have the famous case of Nazareth, holy town for the Christians, occupied by the Israeli army in mid-July 1948. Taken from the Arab Liberation Army, which had held it. And one of the local commanders, the head of the 7th, no, not the head of the 7th Brigade, the head of the number 2 man in Northern Command, issues an expulsion order for the population of Nazareth. And the head of the 7th Brigade, a man called Ben Dunkelman, who happened to be a volunteer colonel from the Canadian Army, came to fight for the Israelis against the Arabs, a Jewish tank commander from World War II. Ben Dunkelman, commander of the 7th Brigade, says, no, you can't expel. I don't agree. His unit had occupied Nazareth, and I'm not carrying this order out. And so the two generals or colonels send their argument up to Ben-Gurion, who's the defense minister, and ask him to rule, should we expel or not expel the population? And Ben-Gurion writes, and we have the telegram from Northern Command, in which Ben-Gurion writes, don't expel. Now, Ben Gurion may have been thinking about the sensitivities of Christians around the world, hearing about the expulsion of Arabs from this holy Christian town of Nazareth. He may have had other reasons for it, but I think the main reason was when it came out into the open, when others knew about what was going on, Ben Dunkelman and probably the whole hierarchy of the army in Northern Command knew that there was this argument. Ben Gurion didn't want to go down in history as the man who pressed the button and said, expel. He didn't want to go down with the image of an expeller. So when it comes to him for adjudication, when a lot of people know about it, he doesn't say expel, he says, don't expel. That's probably the major reason which drove him. But what I'm saying is there was no policy. And some colonels did what they wanted and some colonels did the opposite. The Israeli army, the Israeli colonels and majors and company commanders and so on were busy fighting a war against the Arabs. They probably, most of them, wanted as few Arabs remaining behind inside Israel as possible. This was the enemy. They'd leave a community behind. They'll shoot up your convoys from behind in your rear. So it's natural for the colonels and majors and whatever it is to want Arabs out. But on the other hand, as I say, some do expel and some don't. We know in the conquest of the north, in Operation Hiram, from the 29th of October until the 1st of November, when they conquer upper central Galilee, the Israeli army, some villagers they expel, some Muslim villagers they expel, some Muslim villagers remain. They expel some Christian villagers, they leave most Christian villagers in place. And an observer, an Israeli foreign ministry official, comes north a few days later and tries to find out what's going on. What's the army's policy? What had been the army's policy in and immediately after the conquest of upper central Galilee? And he says there was no policy. This guy did what he wanted here, and this guy did what he wanted there. Druze were usually treated more leniently. Christians were treated more leniently. But by and large, everybody did what they wanted. Complete balagan, as they call it in Israel. Confusion. No policy. But my reading, and this is to summarize the subject of was expulsion a war aim, would be to say it wasn't policy. There was an atmosphere of transfer, an atmosphere of expulsion after the Yishuv had been attacked for 4 or 5 months by the Palestine Arabs. There was a will to see their backs. But on the other hand, it wasn't translated into policy. And as things turned out, some communities were expelled, some weren't expelled, and a lot of Arabs remained in Israel. Today, Israel has 1.6 million Israeli Arab citizens. Again, about 20% of the country, as opposed to 80% who are Jewish. It's worth paying attention to this, incidentally. It's an interesting demographic fact. Israeli Arabs constituted 20% of the country in 1949. In 2019, they still constitute 20 or 22% of the country, despite the fact that the country was inundated by Jewish immigrants, 3 million of them, between 1948 and 2019. In other words, Arab birth rates were so high that they remained a constant 20%, despite an enormous influx of Jews coming as immigrants to Israel. A third important element in my conclusions, I think, is to do with the refugee problem. One of the sensitive ones. And here the problem is that I discovered, and there wasn't a great revelation in terms of me discovering it, but people somehow didn't notice that this was the fact. The 1948 created 3 refugee problems. One, the Palestine Arab refugee problem, exists to this day, and therefore everybody knows there is a Palestine Arab refugee problem. 700,000 Arabs were uprooted, approximately, there's arguments about the number. 700,000 were uprooted from their homes in 48, and today on the United Nations rolls, there are something like 5.5, 6 million Palestinian refugees. In other words, the very few who remain from 48 of the original 700,000, plus their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. All of them are accepted as Palestinian Arab refugees. Almost 6 million on United Nations books today. The war created 2 other refugee problems, both of which vanished. One was a problem of Israeli refugees or Jewish refugees in Palestine. The war caused a Jewish refugee problem in Palestine. Thank you. In which 70,000 Jews were displaced from their homes. Now, 70,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but if the population is 650,000, it's over 10% of the Israeli Jewish population was displaced from their homes in the course of the 48 war. Say in America there was a 10% refugee problem, we're talking about 30 million people being displaced from their homes. So it's an enormous problem for a community of 650,000. There was an Israeli Jewish refugee problem created by the war, by the Arab invasions, by Palestinian attacks, by conquest of Jewish villages from which Jews fled or were expelled, and 70,000 people were displaced, leaving their kibbutzim or whatever, Yad Mordechai, Masada, Shara Golan, and so on, and being moved to homes or public buildings in Tel Aviv, Haifa, in the center, the interior of the Jewish holdings in Palestine. Now, this problem vanished, of course, immediately after the war. In most places were reconquered. Those which had been conquered by Arab troops in the north, in the south, were reconquered by Israel. And the population, the people who left these villages, settlements, were returned to them. So they were able to go back by 49, and there was no refugee problem. Or they were absorbed in other places. The Jewish community which lived in the old city of Jerusalem in its Jewish quarter was expelled by the Jordanian Arab Legion on the 29th of May 1948, was absorbed inside West Jerusalem, in Jewish West Jerusalem. So they didn't go back to where they were in the old city, though some of their descendants did when Israel conquered the West Bank and East Jerusalem in 1967, after 67. But most of them simply were resettled in Israel proper after 1948. So there was no Israeli Jewish refugee problem from the 48 war. It didn't last. It didn't sustain itself. It wasn't sustained. The third refugee problem created by the 48 war was the refugeedom of the Jewish communities who had lived in the Arab world for centuries, even thousands of years. In the case of, say, the Iraqi Jewish community, they were displaced as a result of the war, either in 48-49 or in the decade and a half following that war, from their homes. In other words, 130,000 Jews who lived in Iraq. A third of the population of Baghdad in 1948 was Jewish. A third of the population of Baghdad in 1948 was Jewish. They held most of the economy in their hands. Much of the civil service of modern Iraq was Jewish in 1948. They were among those 130,000 Iraqi Jews who were displaced in 1950, basically, 49 also, but 50, and vanished. Today in Iraq, maybe there's 2 Jews living in Baghdad, that's about it. No Jews live in Iraq. The Moroccan Jewish community, 400,000 strong, in a number of stages, fled or left Morocco during the 50s and 60s. By 64, no Moroccan Jewish community. Maybe there's 2,000 or 3,000 Moroccan Jews living in Morocco today, but there were 400,000 there in 1948. In Yemen, there was a large Jewish community. Today, there's a couple of dozen Jews live in Yemen. There were 70,000 Jews in Yemen in 1947. 48, 49, none of them were left. They all left. Now, most of these 700,000 to 800,000 Jews, and the number is fairly similar to the number of Palestinians who were uprooted from their homes, 700,000 to 800,000 Jews who lived in the Arab world, most of them, 90%, 80%, whatever it is, moved to Israel. Nobody else really wanted them, and the upper class usually fled to France or Britain, and the majority, who were lower class, poor, many of them illiterate, ended up in Israel. So Israel absorbed in the 50s and 60s something like 700,000 Jews from the Arab world, creating incidentally a Sephardi Ashkenazi problem inside Israel in the manner of their absorption. And we can talk about it if you like later, but but this was the result of the creation of a refugee population of Jews from the Arab lands as a result of the 48 war. During 48-49, the Iraqi and Egyptian governments arrested hundreds, if not thousands, of leading Iraqi and Egyptian Jews, put them in concentration camps, demanded large sums of money from these communities to finance their war in Palestine. Bombs were thrown at Jews. Jews were killed here and there in Cairo, in Alexandria, in Damascus, in Baghdad, tortured to death by the authorities. All of this was essentially a large-scale campaign of intimidation. The Jews from Arab lands were not expelled by the Arab governments, but they were intimidated into flight by the societies among whom they lived and by the governments under whom they lived, who essentially wanted them out. Wanted them out because they automatically identified the Jews in these communities in the Arab lands with the Jews of Palestine, with the Zionist enterprise. Even though they were non-Zionist, or many of them didn't support Zionism or even opposed to Zionism, but the Arab governments and societies among whom they lived said these Jews can't be trusted. They will support the Jews in Palestine against us Arabs. See what they did to the Palestinians. We want them out. And they were intimidated into flight. One or two places there were expulsions. In Egypt in 56, some Jews were actually expelled by Nasser's government at the end of the 56 war. But essentially they weren't expelled, they simply fled as a result of intimidation. There is no problem of Jewish refugeedom from Arab lands today. Why is there no problem? Because however well or poorly they were absorbed in Israel, and they all eventually got housing, education, jobs, and so on, they were absorbed in Israel, and as I say, a small minority of wealthier ones in Paris and London and other places. And so the problem of Jewish refugeedom from Arab countries no longer exists. There is no Jewish refugee problem from the Arab lands. Though today you will hear occasionally voices raised in Israel saying, well, if the Palestinian refugees have to be compensated, at least the Arab governments demand their return. The Palestinian Arabs demand the return of those refugees and their descendants. But if they have to be compensated, Jews from Arab lands who lost enormous amounts of property, probably as much as the Palestinians, if not more. The Jews in Baghdad or Cairo were extremely wealthy, for example. They demand they too be compensated. The Palestinians, of course, say, we didn't expel them from Iraq or Morocco. This is the Moroccans and Iraqis are responsible. It's got nothing to do with us Palestinian refugees. But some of the descendants of these Jews from the Arab lands, and occasionally other spokesmen say, well, if Palestinian Arabs are being or to be compensated, Jews from Arab lands should also be compensated as well. There's an asymmetry though here, because the Palestinian Arab refugees want to return to Palestine. The Jews from Arab lands don't want to go back to Arab lands. Nobody wants to live under Saddam Hussein or even a more benign regime, you know, the king and the sultan in Morocco. They don't want to go back there, whereas the Palestinian Arabs do want to return. So there is this asymmetry, but there is also symmetry. I'll talk about one last subject which emerged in the book, and that's the subject of the balance of forces. Or to put it simply, which side was stronger in the 48 war? Well, the truth is, of course, that wars are won by the stronger side. And the 48 war was won by the stronger side. But then it's a matter of what makes one side stronger? What makes the Viet Cong and Vietnamese North Vietnam stronger than the United States and beats the United States in the Vietnam War? Even though the United States is 100 times stronger and has 500 times more atomic bombs and so on. But these weren't brought to bear in Vietnam. The full power of America, the full power of its atomic weaponry and so on. So the Vietnamese managed to put more power into the battlefields in the end than did the Americans, and the Vietnamese won. The same applies really to what happened in Palestine. The Arab world is vast. We're talking about tens of millions of people at the time. Now it's hundreds of millions. Then it was tens of millions, as opposed to 650,000 Jews in Palestine. But the 650,000 Jews managed to get from their midst more power, to bring to bear more power, to mobilize more power than did the Arabs of Palestine, who outnumbered them 2-1, or the Arab world, which outnumbered them 20 or 30 or 40-1. This is expressed in a number of ways, and it's not just only a matter of military power. On the military side, and this sounds a bit strange, but the Jews generally put in the field more troops than the Arabs did. And we're talking about not just the Palestinian Arabs, but the Arab states, all of them together, after they invaded Palestine. On the day of the invasion, just to give you an idea, on the day of the invasion, 15 May, when 4 Arab armies crossed the borders into Palestine, the Arab invading army probably numbered about 20,000. Walid Khalidi, one of the Palestinian historians, says it was actually 13,000, but I would upgrade that a bit and say 20,000 Arab soldiers crossed the border that day. They were faced by, or confronted by, 30,000 Jewish troops. In other words, more Jewish troops were opposed to them than they were able to field on that day. And the numbers kept growing in the same way. In July 1948, there are about 60,000 Jewish troops and now it's the Israeli army. The Israeli army was created on the 1st of June, 48, on the basis of what was called the Haganah, the militia of the left wing. By July 1948, the Jewish army numbered 60,000, and the Arab armies probably had about 40,000 troops fighting in Palestine at the time. By the end of the war, the Jews have, as I say, 100,000 troops, and the Arab armies may be in the whole theater of operations in Palestine, around it, probably something like 50, 60,000 troops. So the Jews, even in terms of numbers, have more fighting men than the Arabs. But one has to qualify all these things. The invading Arab army on the 15th of May are combat formations. In other words, the teeth units of the Arab armies, whereas the 30,000 Jews who face them are half rear echelon troops and half combat formations. So you've got more Arab combat formation troops than Jewish combat formation troops on the 15th of May, even though the Jews have more troops than the Arabs do. But overall, the Jews have a numerical superiority. Now, and just on this one anecdote on this subject before going on to a wider definition of power and what makes a society strong or weak in a war. In a conference in Queens College, University of the City of New York, about a decade or something ago, I gave a talk partly about this subject, and in the audience, actually one of the speakers, but he was in the audience, was a man called Yitzhak Navon, who was one of Israel's presidents, and happened to have before that been Ben-Gurion's secretary, and in 1948 was an Israeli intelligence officer, Yitzhak Navon. And he stands up in the audience, we're talking about 1990 or something, in Queens, and he says, "This isn't true what you're saying. We were weaker. They were strong. They were much stronger than us." And he says, in Jerusalem, when I was there in June, July, whenever it was, 1948, they had more guns, more power, more troops than we did. And this may be true. People's memories are like that. They sort of telescope things, and they see things, what happened in their immediate vicinity. They don't see the wide picture. So at the time, in various places, in the battle for Nirim and the battle for Yad Mordechai in May 1948, it's true the Egyptians had more power than the troops facing them, than the Israelis in specific sites. But overall, when you look at the overall numbers, the Jews had an advantage in manpower in the war. Now, strength doesn't equal manpower. Strength is much wider than that. You have to talk about the types of weaponry, the ability to use the weaponry, the munitions for the weaponry, say the Egyptian Air Force. The Egyptian Air Force outnumbers the Israeli Air Force in October 1948, probably 3-4 times as many aircraft, combat aircraft. But the Israelis are able in October 1948 to send 240 missions into the air with only 12 planes. During October, against the Egyptian army in the south, they fly 240 missions. The Egyptian Air Force is able to put in the air only 60 missions because their pilots are all either dead or incompetent, or their ground crews don't know how to fix the planes, or they don't have the munitions, the bombs and the machine guns for, machine gun bullets for the aircraft and so on. So the numbers aren't always that important. It's maintenance is important. The skill of pilots, the Israeli pilots, most of them came from abroad. They weren't Israelis. Many of them were or Israelis who had fought in Western air forces in World War II, or were simply volunteers from the West. Jewish pilots or non-Jewish pilots who came from America or England or South Africa and volunteered to help the Jews, but they were combat experience from World War II. The Arabs had nothing like that because they didn't fight in World War II. They didn't have combat experience pilots. So they have 60 airplanes, the Jews have 12 airplanes. The 12 airplanes are much stronger than the 60 airplanes, partly because of that. Also, money is very important in wars. How do you finance wars? How do you buy the munitions and get the munitions in? And the Jews did have the backing of American Jewry and Jewish communities elsewhere who gave them a lot of money. The Arabs, confrontation states, were poor, and the Arabs who did have money, Saudi Arabia and whatever, not as much money as today, but still wealthy, didn't give very much money to the Arabs fighting the war. So the Jews had much, much more money with which to buy things, and by the end of the war, Israel has much larger stockpiles of munitions and armaments than the whole Arab world, because the Jews have been buying and buying and buying, and were able to bring, clandestinely or not, the munitions and the weaponry from Europe and from Mexico and wherever to Israel, whereas the Arabs didn't have this capacity to move weaponry and munitions clandestinely, and also didn't have the money to purchase these things. So this is also important. There's also I'll say one more last thing on this, there's also the matter of morale and motivation. The Jews were fighting with their backs to the wall, and they knew they were fighting with their backs to the wall, and this happened 3 years after the Holocaust. And most Israeli Jews in 1948 believed that if the Arabs win the war, they will slaughter the Jews and their families in Tel Aviv and Haifa. They will kill everybody. This was the view. Maybe it's not true, but this is what the Jews thought the Arabs would do if they won the war. And this is 3 years after the Holocaust, when the world allowed the Jews to be slaughtered. The world will allow it to happen again in Palestine. So the Jews are fighting for their lives, their families, and statehood as well. The Arabs, well, when you think about Egyptian troops and Iraqi troops coming from Baghdad or the Nile Valley to fight in Palestine, well, they may be motivated to some degree by religion, but they're not fighting with their backs to the wall. They're not fighting for their families and homes. They're mercenaries coming to fight in a war somewhere else, hundreds of miles away. And the Palestine Arabs also knew that they had somewhere to go to. The Jews had the sea behind them, nowhere to go to. You lose, there's a sea. The Palestine Arabs can go to the West Bank, they can go to Jordan, so they don't fight with the same determination. So this is also very important in the balance of power, the motivation to fight and to sacrifice.